I hope you're all having a wonderful morning. Thank you to all of you for coming today. My name is Ritu Shah, and I am the Managing Director at Portal Innovations. I am the founder of what's known as EX Cubed, which stands for Execution, Excellence, and Elevation. And it's really around providing fractional support to biotech companies as they prepare for their next round of funding. Thanks for asking me to moderate the panel today. I'm really excited to be surrounded by this highly coveted group of ladies sitting next to me. And we're going to focus on 3 areas in this panel today. First is going to be around the capital pathways in oncology. I know a lot of us are thinking about that as we start companies in oncology, how are we going to get funding, and thinking about the different channels and sources to fund cancer research. Also, we'll look at investor-startup synergies, so the role of venture capital and public funding. And then finally, we'll think about innovative funding models, so alternative funding models and investor partnerships as we advance oncology. So let's start with introductions today. I'm going to ask Rima, Kristen, and Geeta to do an introduction of themselves, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Ritu, and thanks, Portal Innovations and Cancer Moonshots for having us here today. My name is Rima Chakrabarti. I'm a venture partner at KdT Ventures, and also co-founder and managing partner of what's called Rebel LLC, a new endeavor. So for KdT Ventures, we're a more traditional venture capital firm focused on early stage investment, particularly in the computational biology arena. So anything that has biological insights paired with compute is usually what we look at. We like to be the first institutional check into a company. We're a group of physician scientists, so really what we de-risk is that early data and how can you scale that understanding that you've generated to a product in clinic. We also look at other industries as well, but for the sake of cancer therapeutics, we'll talk about our therapeutic products. And just really quickly for Rebel, this is a venture creation firm focused on technology coming out of Rice University, particularly the bioengineering technology, again focused on drug delivery and creating products that can help patients in clinic.
Thank you, Rima. Kristen?
Good morning. I'm Kristen Doyle. I'm the CEO of Cancer Prevention and Research Institute of Texas, very long name, so we say CPRIT. CPRIT is a $6 billion investment fund that was created by the Texas legislature in 2007 and ratified by a statewide vote twice by Texans, so overwhelmingly support. We are the second largest public funder of cancer research in the country, only behind the federal government. And we're one of the top 10 public funders of cancer research in the world. So to date, we have awarded about $3.65 billion in cancer research and prevention funding in Texas. So 10% of our money can go for cancer prevention efforts, which is great, allows us to touch every county in Texas, and there's 254 of those. But in terms of cancer research, which is 90% of our portfolio, we can invest at academic institutions. But from the very beginning, we've said research also happens at early stage companies. So we fund that, and to date, we have funded 67 companies, committed $700 million to those companies. And if you all tune into our website tomorrow, we will be live streaming our board meeting, and we are getting ready to announce the next round of investment that we're making in several companies. We'll be investing a little more than $60 million in those companies. So it's an exciting time, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you, Kristen. Geeta?
Thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me and giving us the platform to talk about ourselves. My name is Geeta Vemuri. I'm founder and managing partner of a venture capital firm based out of Boston called Agent Capital. We have roughly about $200 million under management in 3 funds, and we actually invest heavily in oncology, immunology, neuroscience, and rare diseases. Before starting the fund, I used to actually work with Ritu at Baxter. I used to run Baxter's venture group, which was, again, about $200 million balance sheet investment that I was doing. Our remit is to invest both early stage as well as late stage. And I actually did the stat. We invested in about 30 companies so far since 2017, and of which 15 are in oncology one way or another. And I think one thing John brought up this morning is, I believe, who all are touched by cancer. I have to say, everyone. We had one of our founding investors, who was former Baxter's CEO, Bob Parkinson. He invested in our first close of our first fund when we were starting out. In 2017, we had the first close. And in 2019, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And within 3 months or 6 months, he passed away. So it was very unfortunate. No amount of money, no amount of knowledge, and connections just did not help despite that. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Ritu.
Thank you. Looking forward to the discussion today. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And actually, Rima, I'll start with you. From your experience at KdT Ventures, what do you think investors are most eager to see in new cancer technologies?
Yes. So I think what's really, if we look at all of the diseases that we are working towards new treatments for, cancer sits in a very unique position because there has historically been a lot of funding towards understanding it, right? I mean, decades ago we were calling it cancer, and today we're calling it triple-negative breast cancer or platinum-resistant ovarian cancer with FR-positive screening, right? The fact that we've gotten to this point of molecular stratification and definition of disease is putting cancer actually way ahead of other disease indications where for example, we're calling Alzheimer's and maybe ApoE4, but we still have to stratify these other indications in the way we have for cancer. So cancer's at this head start. We've defined the disease. And so at KdT, and I can speak for other investors that I'm friendly with, what we look for is that mechanism of action. Do we understand how, let's say, the drug that you're developing is going to modulate the specific disease you're going after? And most importantly, from a top-down approach, what is the clinical problem of that specific disease subset? Can we define it in human? And can we actually monitor mitigation of that disease in human? And what are the markers we're using to do that? If you can tell that story from commercial, clinical, regulatory, and basic biological mechanism of action, that package goes a long way, even if you haven't done all of that work yet. It's kind of presenting the entire product from that point of view. Gets us really excited, even as early stage investors.
It's interesting to me that you just mentioned that, because I wonder if it's difficult sometimes for new companies starting to even know what that disease subset or stratification is. Like, how would you recommend, maybe Kristen or Geeta, if you're seeing this, how do you recommend new founders to think about that, to think about beyond just saying cancer, I'm going after cancer, but I'm going after this when they're talking to investors?
The one thing I'll just start with is speak with clinicians, the people who see those patients, who treat those patients, and understand the clinical problem really well. But I'll love Kristen and Geeta take it too.
So I think, it's very complex, to be honest, okay? Because oncology especially, right, the trials are sometimes very long. The progression-free survival, is great. But then in the end, you also are looking at the survival benefit of the patients. And so it takes really long time. We have one company in our portfolio which almost took 8 years to accrue patients and get the data. And things change. No new science comes up, and then a type of cancer that they were accruing for, kind of midway through, is maybe relevant but not super relevant. So I feel like the community has to come together and kind of really not penalize when you're doing sub-stratification and what have you, because our knowledge is so, kind of in a continuum that we all have to make sure that these companies are successful at the end of the day, especially if they're showing benefit to patients.
And it takes so long, right? I think that's the challenge, is that this drug therapeutics and developing drugs takes, 7 to 10 years? And how do you even line that path? Think about that. in some ways?
Well, one of the things for CPRIT, in terms of that very long pathway, we're really focused on kind of the, I was going to say the beginning. I mean, we're really looking at helping those early stage companies, pull that concept out of the lab and get that early data that then will attract, venture funding. I mean, we always say, if we're the last money in, then we have failed. We need to be helping these companies develop the strategies and, really have, the work that they're going to be doing going down the pathway. So, in terms, we're at the beginning of those 10, 15 years. And we always say, our awards are 3-year awards, but we have, many of our companies are on the 8th year of their 3rd year.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so I think what's really exciting about CPRIT is, of course, that early program. But I will say, even as someone who's currently building a cancer therapeutics company, knowing that the product development grants exist and can fund to an amount that's meaningful for a clinical trial and manufacturing for a clinical trial is really exciting because, to your point, Ritu, it's a really long process to go from discovery into clinic and beyond. But it's incredibly capital intensive, which is what makes it a very difficult prospect for venture capitalists to be investing really early, knowing there's going to have to be multiple rounds of capital where they'll get diluted, but knowing there's a non-dilutive partner who's willing to take on some of the financing risk of what ends up being the most capital intensive piece, which is GMP manufacturing, and that first proof of concept clinical trial is really exciting to have CPRIT doing that.
And we really do think that that is the role that we can play, is filling that gap. I mean, we overuse this, but the valley of death. I mean, it really is the place. There's a lot of money, or relatively a lot of money, for university research, the discovery research, even some translational research, and then once something starts showing promise, starts showing some efficacy, then you get a lot of attention. But it's that, recognizing the potential, taking the risk, helping to de-risk it for future funding. So that's what we really think is the role for what CPRIT is doing, and it has paid off incredible dividends. I think for the companies that we have funded, several of here who are talking today, both in, attracting additional funding, attracting ARPA-H funding, and I'm tremendously proud that Texas was able to put this together and recognize that this was something that needed to be done in terms of cancer research.
So building on that a little bit, Kristen, and just thinking about how you mentioned you really focus, CPRIT really focuses on early stage. How do you really identify projects and companies that align with CPRIT's strategy, though? What's your process? How do you go out there and look, or do companies come to you? Maybe you can give a little bit more about that.
So we're very open door. We put out a request for applications. They're pretty high level applications. So we're asking, we've got one for therapeutics, one for devices and diagnostics, a seed company award, so that's up to $3 million preclinical, and then we have another request for applications that's basically called new technologies. So it's anything that doesn't fit cleanly into the therapeutics and the devices and diagnostics. We have a preliminary application, so you're essentially giving us your slide deck and a 2-page executive summary. And then our reviewers, and let me emphasize this point, I think many of you know this, but again, I've been talking about how we are state money and we're Texas money, and so there's always that view, is politics going to come into this? Is there a thumb on the scale? And from the very beginning, CPRIT has always used a peer review process. And in fact, even in our statute, so in our governing language, my board, who's all politically appointed by the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker, my board can only consider the recommendations that come from the peer reviewers. So if we get 600 applications and 40 applications are recommended, those are the only 40 that the my board can consider. And so that has really protected our process. What we're looking for is really the best science, obviously, but also a good team around that science, that is going to understand especially those hurdles early stage, what they need to be doing in terms of setting up their trials, thinking about the broad reach. And through both of those, I've talked about the preliminary application. We select down from the preliminary application and invite several companies to come and make presentations to us. So this round that we're going to announce tomorrow, we got 90 preliminary applications. We invited 24 companies to submit full applications. 22 did. Each of those companies, then we build a review panel around them of about 7 to 8 people, experts in that area, and then those panels then will recommend to CPRIT which companies should be funded. So all of that process, I think, has really helped identify for us what's the best science, what's a company that's worth investing in.
I have one question for you. How long the whole process takes, roughly?
So that's a good question. We had tried very hard to make it as fast as possible. The preliminary applications that we asked for were due May 1st. We let companies know who was invited to submit their full applications by July 1st. So you knew whether you were moving forward or not by July 1st. They had, I think, a month to submit a full application, and then we set up the 22 review panels. After we do the review panels, we also do a due diligence phase. That's mainly IP, so that gets built in. And then our board has to be the one that makes the decisions. And since we're a state agency, we're governed by open meetings laws, so they can only convene in an open meeting and make those decisions. So that's probably the largest gap between where we know what companies we're funding and when they're actually announced, is just waiting until we have our quarterly meeting.
And I think that because it's more state funding, the process is very well defined. And I think that the question I have for both Geeta and Rima now is, how is your process from private funding, from a venture capital, and what do you have in place, and how long does it take for companies to get funded by either of your VCs?
I'm happy to start. Yeah. So for us, right, we define how many investments we can do per fund. So let's say fund 1, we can do about 10 to 12 investment. And within that, we want to then define how many immunology versus oncology, rare disease, whether it should be a platform that can do both. So that goes into the equation. And then we really spend a lot of time upfront in figuring out where the science is, and kind of look at the companies. So we probably received over 2,000 business plans so far since we formation, and we've funded about 30. So it takes, sometimes we are well prepared, we recognize the science, and can jump in within 3 weeks and move the process forward, right? Okay, sometimes it takes about a couple of years for us to buy into the science and kind of invest. So it's different for each of the companies, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And before you answer, Rima, just quickly, Geeta, do you come in at a specific stage, whereas like CPRIT comes in really early? Where do you see Agent coming in at?
Right. I think we, stage-wise, right, okay, we are agnostic. We can go in preclinical or in the clinic when the company is. But generally for oncology, our preferences now is to go after companies which are more close to clinic. We have stayed away from discovery companies in oncology for this new fund. We've done discovery companies in our previous fund. We were in Pyxis also when you guys did the deal, which was really kind of discovery stage company. But we've moved away from it a little bit, I would say, yeah. But the check, when it goes in, can be seed, Series A, anything. Yeah.
And Rima, your experience with KDT and the process that it takes for you and your organization.
Yeah, so I know this is true for Geeta's team too. We have a relatively small team. We're all physician scientists, and really the questions we ask initially are around the science. Let's look at the data. Let's understand how reproducible it's been. But really, what we're looking for is to invest in a product, right? And I'm going to go back to those layers of risk that I described around what it takes to take good science through clinic and into market in a way that's actually going to help patients and become a tool in the toolkit for physicians. And so in terms of the process at KDT, initially what we look for is this a team of people? It could be, honestly, it could be one or two people, but are they articulating not only the science, but what this product could be? We call it kind of phase 4, take over the world. If this works as a product, these are the lives we can change. This is the impact we can have. But what we spend a lot of time on is understanding, all right, well, we're funding you, first institutional round of capital. What is phase 1? What are you going to accomplish with this round of capital? Let's say it's 3 to 5 million, and maybe we're part of a round. Maybe we often invest in seed. We just closed our 4th fund, which is a larger fund, and so we've been participating in later stage rounds as well. But really that clear articulation, and we are happy to help, and this is part of where the conversation can be weeks or it could be months. What are you going to accomplish is going to drive value in this product development in this company by the time you want to achieve phase 2. And what is phase 2? How does it lead to phase 3? And then ultimately, how does it lead to phase 4? So a lot of what we work on is how do you articulate that product definition, that target product profile in the world of therapeutics. And for a lot of our founders, we back a lot of postdoc and grad student CEOs. A lot of our successful, unicorn companies in Fund 1 were founded and continue to be run by technical CEOs. And they've learned on the job, and our goal, being on the board investing in companies is to build that partnership and help those companies build towards a product in market as quickly as possible. So the big point for us is, depending on where you are in terms of starting to define that product profile, it can take, anywhere from weeks to months. We work quickly, but we're very particular about what we look for before we deploy capital.
And I'm fascinated by how, and I think Geeta wants to say something.
No, I was going to say a little different. We like to really invest in, we are investors first. And so we invest in people with experience. It doesn't have to be just the CEO with experience, can be the CMO, CSO, someone that's done it before, because this industry is so tough, right? And there are so many landmines that you can go wrong, and capital is the most important constraint for all of us. And so we tend to have really someone who is experienced, or someone who's willing to listen to somebody that we bring in with experience. That's important.
And I love that you're saying that, because that was where I wanted to go too, is we talk a lot about the product and the science, but that's just half of it, right? It's the people who are going to move this forward. And so do each of your funds encourage, or how do you bring in sometimes additional talent to help the technical aspects of it?
Yeah, so I'll start with that. So again, sometimes the company that comes to us pitching already has strong experience at the table. Often they don't. And from our point of view, that's okay. I believe strongly that the inventor of the technology, because we're going from early stage science through 7 to 10 years of development to a final product, it's going to require iteration, it's going to require optimization. Development on the technical product matters, and so having someone who understands, and honestly an inventor of that product, or that science well enough to say, here are the tweaks that are tenable, these are the experiments we can run to develop the final product, is important. But then it's a question of, what does the product need to look like? Mm-hmm. And that's where, again, from going from soup to nuts of early discovery to the clinical problem, we love seeing the clinician co-founders or clinician advisors, or just honestly in that deck saying, here is the problem, this is the bottleneck that these patients face, whether it's the actual therapeutic, whether it's missing a biomarker that can be monitored in a clinical trial, or it's form factor, right? Yes, this drug seems to work, but this clinician watches these patients literally wither away in their hospital beds with this treatment, right? What is the definition of that clinical problem? Finding that clinician co-founder is really helpful, and honestly presenting a proof of concept clinical trial design with that partner gets us really excited again to say, all right, I trust that you have kind of the spectrum available, and once you have that, you can find your regulatory help, you can find kind of the other people that are going to come in, but when you're speaking at the level of the clinical problem with maturity, that kind of allows for more people to come in. So again, we're physician scientists at KdTs. That's often where we come in quickly with trying to bring someone to help guide the team early on.
Kristen or Geeta?
So I'll say, and this is where CPRIT is different. We have the capital, but we really don't do a lot after we have funded the company in terms of advising the company. So that is why the team around the science that's being put forward is so important to our reviewers. It doesn't have to be the people that you'll see at the very end of the product, but it has to be the ones that know early on what needs to happen in terms of moving this forward. It's also why, something like Portal Innovations, like TMC, this community is incredibly important to the companies that we are funding. Texas has witnessed, an incredible acceleration in terms of our life science ecosystem. And so some parts of that ecosystem haven't caught up. And a lot of that is C-level talent. I mean, we're working as hard as we can and as fast as we can to bring in more C-level talent to develop what we have here through a lot of programs. But we rely on the community, and Houston is a hotbed for that. We're seeing so much change from definitely a decade ago to even 5 years ago, and what we'll see in 5 years. And so, it is wonderful when we continue to bring in, groups like Portal Innovations to Texas, J Labs, all of the resources that are here in Texas.
Yeah, no, I think same thing. Well said. We really believe in talent. We believe in surrounding the inventors with talented people. We ourselves have our venture partners who have done this before, put the products on the market. Ritu, you know them. And so it's that support, that knowledge of how to prepare a company to go and talk to the regulatory authorities is super important, right? Okay, so we tend to definitely help out with all of that. And then certainly when we syndicate and work with investors, we want to see if the other investors are in it for the long haul and also will bring talent to the table. Those are important for us.
I'll add one thing very quickly. So CPRIT requires matching funds. So for every $2 that we put in, we require $1 of hard dollars spent on the same project that we're funding at the same time. That has also helped because oftentimes that comes from investors that are very interested and can provide a lot of that help.
And just very quickly, sorry. I was going to say, for example, one company we started, one of my partners was COO of the company initially to run it for some time. And then, of course, we brought in the CEO, and now he stepped back. And myself, I'm chairwoman of a startup company right now. I don't know how much time I spend. The CEO can tell you, how do you do your other work when you show up all the time? So there's a lot of hand-holding at initial stages, yeah.
The only thing I was going to say is, if anyone's seeking capital, it is really important to think through not just, okay, what is the product I'm going to develop at the end, but who is the investment partner that I'm going to be bringing in, who's going to be able to help me see around corners and actually understand what I'm going to be missing as I'm moving this forward relentlessly into clinic, right? Because there is somewhat of a playbook, at least in terms of understanding kind of all the silos of industry that need to be met and shaken hands with across the path from early science to a clinical program. And that's something, so, I'm a physician by training, have been an investor, and so I can speak a little bit of experience for what we're building with Rebel and with our first portfolio company, Sentinel, which is a clinical stage company. And, there is that entrepreneurial, you just move fast and break things. But once you hit the FDA, regulatory conversations, there's a way you need to do things. In fact, you need a publisher to even send the email to the FDA, and that's a whole other third party, right? And so I think there's two parts to that, right? It's understanding when and how consultants can be really helpful, where they know the language, they know how to traverse this hurdle towards getting this product into clinic. It's not always easy to understand who's going to be the right person. So I think with everyone here on the stage, it's having the experience with people who've done it before, who can just point you towards, hey, this is my person. I promise you won't be steered wrong. Just make sure you're budgeting for it, right? And so there is that kind of, as you start to hit the clinic, you need to be thoughtful of who your partners are.
Rima and I were actually on a panel a couple of weeks ago together, and the phrase that keeps coming to mind as I'm listening to all three of you talk about is smart money. That as you're thinking about who you're going to be working with and the investors you're going after, that there is such a thing as smart money, because how they're going to help you and bring you forward and along is really important. So it seems to be coming alive in this conversation. Question for all of you. Obviously today is very focused on oncology, but a lot of our companies that we see maybe have a platform, and oncology is an asset. There may be an asset that's oncology based, and I know, Geeta, you and I were talking about that earlier with some of the companies you invest in. Kristen, from a CPRIT level, is that okay for some of the companies, that if they're not just oncology focused, but it's one of the assets, they can still apply for investment opportunities?
So I'll say it in a couple different ways. What we really are looking for, because especially at this point, we have many companies that we aren't funding. We have a lot of excellent research projects that we're not funding. So not just CPRIT, but our reviewers are also incredibly jealous of that money and protective, and want to make sure that somebody's not just trying to sneak in with, some sort of cancer indication. They're really going to be funding something else, because at that point we'd like to deploy our money somewhere else. And like I said, our reviewers are always the first and almost the last stage. And the way our process is set up is we can't even talk. We can observe the discussions, but we can't participate in the discussion at all. So it's very interesting to see how our reviewers even handle this idea. Now, we have had many companies that we have funded that is not just limited to oncology in terms of its eventual application. And then sometimes that can be a beneficial part of the review. That'll be something that the reviewers will see as a way to de-risk this. But at least for CPRIT, we're very focused on oncology.
That's a great. I actually had one question for Kristen. What happens if, let's say, along the way, the oncology project that you funded thinks that, okay, immunology is a better place to be? Then do you stop it? Do you want them to pay back the money? How does that go?
So we don't do paybacks unless they have spent the money in a way that was clearly against what our contract is. So we're not that, but it is harder for us to pivot. Most often we would say, let's go ahead and terminate this contract and have you apply again. Some of that is just because of the way that we are set up. They want those decisions, those million-dollar decisions, to be coming from a review panel rather than, one or two individuals to be making that decision. So it's a little harder for us to be that flexible. Now, one of the ways that you can address that as an applicant, and we encourage this and we tell them over and over, is come up with your, the backup plan also. Tell us about that, and so that we know and we've evaluated it and we have said, this is what we want to fund. We're funding your first indication, but we also know about your second indication, and then you can pivot to that if necessary.
And then how much returns are important for CPRIT? Do you return on capital? Is that?
Well, of course, we are very interested in getting a drug to market or getting a product to market and making money for the state of Texas to go and pay back. So we're bond funded. So we're literally paying for this research on the state's credit card, essentially. All of the bonds that are funded, any money that comes in goes to help pay off that debt obligation. At the same time, we are very motivated by the best science rather than the best return. We want a return, and we have to certify for every award that we're making that we expect it to make a return. But, we're not just going to be looking at what is the biggest possible return. And in fact, we fund a lot of rare cancer, which is, that is the push-pull for us. We've had some companies that have done exceptionally well, but have not been able to attract the funding, for their phase 3 trial because they the investors just don't see the potential for a large payoff. And it was mentioned before, I'll say this again, one of the ways that we try and help our companies early on is that we are non-dilutive funding. So we only make money if you make money at the end in royalties. And that has helped a tremendous amount, because most of the time when we are putting our money in, we would overwhelm the cap table and would potentially turn away other investors.
No, thank you so much. So, very interesting. Actually, I was going to say, Ritu, to your point, yes, many of our companies, such as Dragonfly, right? Okay, they have investments, they have products which are neurology, immunology, and also oncology. So we like that coming out of a platform, just because it makes it, the optionality to make returns are pretty decent. You have companies that are focused on immunology sometimes can do the deal, right? And then, oncology, as we said, can take a little longer, but that money coming in can definitely support oncology for them, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point, just with all of that back and forth of what is the goal of a venture capitalist, right, versus something like CPRIT. And, you were going to bring this up, right? Like Geeta and I, our funds are funded by private investors, by LPs, and our job, first and foremost, to be excellent investors is to return capital to our investors. And so often the challenge with venture capitalists in, curing cancer is the goal isn't explicitly to cure cancer. It's to generate returns and hopefully help patients along the way. And so often the indication pivot can come from let's say you're underwriting a cancer indication to begin with, but then in the market there's either a failure of a drug in a similar space and a similar indication, and that completely shuts down the amount of the funding from those partners who are capable of funding clinical trials, right? Because those are ones who often will do both private and public investing, deploy a larger amount of capital. If they're not interested or not, kind of cool down on a certain space, often a pivot will have to occur within the company. And that's part of the challenge. But I do think that at the end of the day, if you can get to phase 2 efficacy in a high unmet need indication, and that's where, again, going top-down matters so much, and you can do that with a partner like CPRIT, it's hard for investors to look away from a more developed product, right, that's solving a real clinical problem. But
I was going to say cell therapy, as an example, is kind of beaten down right now, right? Investors are not getting in, but some of the products are making millions of dollars of revenues, right? So, this is where it's so nice to see some other ways to leverage capital, yeah.
I was going to say, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add that this point about a company that's in clinic but couldn't raise capital to raise phase 3, I mean, this is actually one of our strategies at Rebel is we just acquired a clinical stage asset that has really beautiful data, but couldn't acquire capital because of management and honestly large cap table issues, where if we now start a new company, and I know this is the case for, I'm sure others in the room, you can kind of start fresh from a capital point of view and allow investors an opportunity to invest early in a clinical stage asset. And that can change the game for how investors think about their potential return profile too. And so I think more of an effort to find those companies and get them into market is really important.
But also probably because it takes so long, by time a company may be getting into phase 3, there might be already something out there. And so like, is that best in class worth the additional funding at this point if there's something out there, I'm sure. I have another question. I'm not sure if I see the timers going negative, and not used to seeing a negative number when I am up here, but I have another question, and then I promise I'll get off. You started the conversation, Rima, and I'm fascinated by it, with focusing on specific subsets of oncology or stratification. So I'm asking all three of you, maybe before we, as our last question, are there specific oncology stratification subsets that you're going after or that you want to see, or that are some have already been out there for a long time and so you're not as interested in them? I'm just curious to see if there's something that specifically a type of cancer or type of research you're looking for to address.
So I'll start, and I've got two responses. One, and I know that I've talked a lot about therapeutics, but CPRIT also invests in devices and diagnostics and in new technologies. And we have really struggled with getting devices and diagnostics, A, to apply, and then B, for us to fund, to make it through the review process. So I'll say this again, I try and say this at every presentation that I give. You know, we've tried a lot of different ways to make, to get out the word about devices and diagnostics and to make our award and our review process attractive for that. So I'm putting that out there. The other thing that I'll say, and kind of it goes along with what we were just talking about, you know, I do think one of the things about CPRIT is, you know, we've been investing now for 15 years. We'll invest for at least another 6 years. And we have been able to, we don't have to ride the trends. You know, we can fund, you know, what we think is a good indication right now without having to say, oh, you know, ADCs are hot right now, or radiotherapies, and we're going to put our money there. You know, we don't have any preconceived notions, and we're willing to ride with you, and hopefully in the 4 years that it takes you to get the data that you need, you know, your indication is back to being interesting. So that wasn't really an answer to your question on either way, but
No, and I appreciate you bringing up the device and diagnostics, because that is such an important part of having the diagnosis of a specific cancer early on, or what you're going to be able to do. So I appreciate that. Rima or Geeta?
I think the only one I would say is we are not stratifying really, but places where we can actually have PFS as an approval endpoint is what we are leaning towards, yeah.
And, you know, KdT hat on, that computational piece is really interesting. And so honestly, discovering new biomarkers that are non-invasively collected so we can actually monitor easily through the course of a clinical trial and actually gain efficiencies not only in what the biomarker is and to be able to track it, the ability to actually run a clinical trial for cheaper. Those are the efficiencies we look to compute to solve. And so, you know, we have companies where we invested in therapeutics and they have a radiomic discovered biomarker that we can monitor through imaging. Or it's, you know, cell-free DNA, but it's the way it's being measured is very rapid testing. And it's kind of how do we actually use technology to our benefit to monitor progression of a very specific disease in clinic.
Do you have one more comment? No, okay.
Just saying that's the boot for us.
Well, thank you very much for having us today. I hope you all learned as much as I did. And thank you to Geeta, Kristen, and Rima.